At just 15, Michael Calci was already on a path that few teenagers could even imagine. A high school student from the suburbs of Montreal, Canada, he lived a seemingly normal life on the outside. An average kid, with average friends, who went to school just like anyone else. But behind closed doors in the flickering light of his computer monitor, Michael was anything but average. He was Mafia boy, an ambitious hacker, determined to prove something not just to his peers, but to the entire world. February 7th, 2000 would be the day Michael would push the boundaries of what was thought possible. It would also be the day that forever changed the way the internet was understood, a turning point that left tech giants shaken, and internet users across the globe questioning their security. But how could a teenager, barely old enough to drive, launch an attack on a company like Yahoo, valued at over $100 billion? The answer lay within his curiosity and the world he built for himself, a world without boundaries, rules, or limits. The morning of February 7th started like any other, an unassuming winter day in Montreal. Yet at his computer desk, Michael was already set to alter the world of cybersecurity forever. With just a few keystrokes, Michael launched a distributed denial-of-service DDoS attack. His target? Yahoo, then the biggest search engine in the world. The aim was simple. Overwhelm Yahoo's servers by flooding them with an enormous amount of requests, effectively paralyzing them and making their website unavailable to users worldwide. This plan wasn't just born out of malice or boredom. It was born out of a deep fascination with technology and a desire to prove himself. To Michael, hacking was like a game. It gave him power, an adrenaline rush like no other. It was the idea that from his small bedroom in Montreal he could reach across continents and make an impact, to disrupt, to be noticed, and to be feared. This feeling of empowerment, the thrill of breaking into supposedly secure systems, gave him a sense of control that eluded him in his everyday life. He wasn't just Michael Calci anymore, he was Mafia boy, someone who could make powerful entities shake. But behind every thrilling move there was always the fear. The fear of getting caught, the fear of seeing his name splashed across headlines, knowing that his actions were not simply games. They carried consequences. Michael knew that what he was doing was illegal, that he was walking on thin ice. He understood the risks, but the allure was far too strong to ignore. His youth offered a sense of invincibility, a belief that he could outwit everyone else, even the federal authorities who were bound to come knocking when this was all over. The attack was swift, brutal, and efficient. Within minutes, Yahoo's servers were overwhelmed, their website completely inaccessible to millions of users around the world. Panic spread throughout Yahoo. SE offices as engineers scrambled to understand what was happening. How could such a giant be brought down so easily? Millions of dollars were being lost by the minute. Advertisers were furious, investors were worried, and for a moment the internet, still in its relative infancy, looked fragile. If Yahoo could be targeted, who would be next? Michael watched all of this unfold, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. It worked. He had done it. He had taken down the biggest website in the world, and the internet had felt it. But he knew this was just the beginning. This was the spark that would ignite his reputation, the first stone thrown in what would soon become a storm. Michael's obsession with hacking didn't just come out of nowhere. Growing up, he was fascinated by computers, often spending hours tinkering with them, trying to understand how they worked. He was a bright kid, but school bored him. The rigid structure, the mundane routines, it all felt meaningless compared to the thrill of discovery he found online. The internet was his playground, a place where he could explore, learn, and challenge himself without limitations. It was here that he first encountered the underground hacking community, people who, like him, saw the world differently. They were rebels, explorers, and Michael found himself drawn to their mindset. In many ways, Michael's hacking was a form of rebellion. He was rebelling against authority, against the expectations placed on him, and against the feeling of powerlessness that came with being just another teenager. The world didn't take him seriously, but online he could be whoever he wanted. He could command respect, instill fear, and leave a mark. His parents, his teachers, his peers, they had no idea what he was capable of. The more he learned, the more he pushed himself to take on bigger challenges, and Yahoo was the ultimate challenge, a symbol of the establishment that he wanted to disrupt. What drove Michael to this point? How did a 15-year-old become one of the most notorious cybercriminals of his time? To understand that, we need to go back to the childhood that shaped him, the moments that drew him closer to the computer screen, to a fascination that would ultimately lead him down a dangerous path. The story of Michael Kelsey is not just one of crime, it's one of curiosity, rebellion, and the yearning for significance in a world that often ignored him. But now he was no longer invisible. The world would remember the name Mafia Boy. In the late 1990s, the internet was rapidly evolving, with companies like Yahoo leading the charge. Yahoo wasn't just any website. It was the internet's beating heart, serving as the premier search engine and a hub for various online services that millions of users relied upon daily. At the dawn of the digital age, Yahoo was more than a company. It was a symbol of how far technology could take us. Its servers handled an astronomical amount of data and requests, making it a foundational pillar of the internet. For those in the know, especially hackers and cybersecurity enthusiasts, it also represented the ultimate challenge, a fortress that, if breached, could shake the entire world. Michael Kelsey, known online as Mafia Boy, was just 15, but he had a drive that set him apart from his peers. He wasn't your average high school student. In his suburban Montreal home, he spent countless hours on his computer, exploring the vast and uncharted territories of the internet. He was driven by curiosity, a desire to test boundaries, and a belief that he could make a name for himself in the shadowy corners of the digital landscape. Despite his young age, Michael had developed a profound understanding of computer networks, cybersecurity weaknesses, and how to exploit them. His mind was sharp, his skills were advanced, and his ambition was limitless. He was determined to prove something, not just to himself, but to the entire world. In early February 2000, Michael began formulating a plan, one that would send shockwaves across the globe. His mission was simple yet audacious. He would bring down one of the most visited websites in the world to show just how fragile the internet's infrastructure really was. He wanted to prove that even the giants could fall, and there was no bigger giant at the time than Yahoo, the most popular search engine and one of the most visited destinations online. Michael wanted to show that power could be challenged, and he, a lone teenager, would be the one to do it. It wasn't just about disrupting a website. It was about sending a message, a declaration that the world's most powerful systems could be vulnerable. The attack was set for February 7, 2000. It started as an unassuming winter morning in Montreal, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary seemed likely to happen. But for Michael, it was the culmination of all his sleepless nights, his careful planning, and his burning ambition. Sitting at his computer, with only the hum of the machine to accompany him, Michael prepared to execute the plan he had aptly named Project Rivolta, Italian for uprising. He was ready to rise against the establishment, to make his mark. The quiet of his room was at odds with the chaos he was about to unleash, a strange serenity before the storm. Using a network of compromised computers, what we now refer to as zombie machines, Michael launched a distributed denial of service, DDoS attack against Yahoo. The concept behind a DDoS attack is deceptively simple. Overwhelm the target servers with so many requests that they can no longer respond to legitimate users. But pulling it off successfully is anything but simple. It requires coordination, precision, and control over a vast network of systems. For Michael, this meant leveraging vulnerabilities in other computers across the globe, turning them into unwitting participants in his uprising. It was a masterful orchestration, one that would test the limits of his skill and patience. As he typed in the final commands and initiated the attack, Michael's heart raced. There was a sense of exhilaration in knowing that he was taking on something so massive. The requests began pouring into Yahoo's servers by the thousands, then by the millions, flooding the system with traffic far beyond its capacity. Within minutes, Yahoo's servers were overwhelmed. The biggest search engine in the world went dark. Millions of users around the globe who tried to access Yahoo were greeted with an error message. The seemingly invincible giant had been brought to its knees by a 15-year-old kid from Montreal. The magnitude of what Michael had done was overwhelming, even to him. The impact was immediate and widespread. Panic ensued in Yahoo's offices. Engineers worked frantically to figure out what was happening, initially suspecting internal issues, then quickly realizing they were under attack. The sheer scale of the disruption was unlike anything they had seen before. Yahoo was losing millions of dollars every minute, as advertisers began pulling their campaigns, furious over the lack of visibility. Investors, too, were worried, and the stock price wavered as uncertainty gripped the market. The exact financial impact is difficult to determine, but estimates suggest that Yahoo lost around $500,000 due to the downtime, not to mention the longer-term reputational damage that would follow. The event exposed just how vulnerable even the most sophisticated systems were, something that rattled not only Yahoo, but also the entire industry. The public was in shock. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, plastering headlines across newspapers and TV screens. Internet giant Yahoo, taken down by cyber attack. People couldn't believe that a single individual could disrupt such a massive platform. It was a wake-up call not just for Yahoo, but for the entire world, highlighting just how vulnerable the internet truly was. If a major company like Yahoo could be taken offline, what did that mean for the rest of the burgeoning online world? It sparked a fear that maybe, just maybe, the internet wasn't as secure as everyone had hoped. People began questioning their trust in the web. Was their information safe? Could other companies be next? Yahoo's response was swift, but frantic. They bolstered their defenses, collaborating with cybersecurity experts and law enforcement agencies to try and understand the nature of the attack and, most importantly, to identify who was behind it. The company knew it had to act fast, not only to recover from the immediate attack, but also to regain the trust of its users, advertisers, and investors. For Yahoo, this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a moment of reckoning. The illusion of invincibility had been shattered, and they were left to pick up the pieces and adapt. Meetings were held around the clock, and engineers worked tirelessly, trying to patch vulnerabilities and ensure that something like this could never happen again. But the damage was done. The world had witnessed a chink in the armor of the digital titan. As Michael sat at his computer watching the chaos unfold in real time, he experienced a mixture of emotions: pride, fear, exhilaration, and dread. He had proven his point, but at what cost? He knew he had crossed a line, and with every news report that aired, every article that was published, the realization of what he had done began to sink in deeper. He wasn't just Mafia Boy, the anonymous hacker who had bested one of the biggest companies in the world. He was Michael Calci, a 15-year-old kid who had just painted a massive target on his back. He felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. While the world was watching in awe, he was left alone with the knowledge of what he had unleashed. The thrill of seeing Yahoo go offline was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The authorities would come after him. It was only a matter of time. But even then, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had taken on the giants and he had won, if only for a brief moment. The fallout was yet to come, but for now he was at the center of a story that the entire world was watching. He had shaken the foundation of the digital age, and for that, there was a strange, intoxicating sense of fulfillment. The hack on Yahoo was just the beginning. Little did Michael know, the ripples of his actions would soon turn into waves as he set his sights on even bigger targets. The world was about to witness a series of attacks that would go down in history, and Michael would find himself deeper in the game than he could have ever imagined. But before we get there, ask yourself, were you aware of this incident when it happened? How does it make you feel to know that a teenager could bring a billion-dollar company to its knees? This was just one chapter in Michael's story, a story that was far from over. The digital revolution was here, and Mafia Boy had become its unlikely face. Stay tuned, because what happened next would make headlines yet again, and the name Mafia Boy would become synonymous with a digital revolution that no one saw coming. This was only the beginning, and the ride was about to get even wilder. The thrill of watching Yahoo crumble under his fingertips was intoxicating, but for Michael Calci, known to the world as Mafia Boy, That thrill wasn't enough. He had thrown the first stone, but the ripples had only begun to form. The real question in Michael's mind wasn't whether he could take down more giants of the internet. It was a question of when. He wanted to push the boundaries even further to prove not only to the world but also to himself that what he did to Yahoo was just a taste of what he was capable of. The world had no idea what was coming next, and Michael knew he held the power to keep them on edge. It was a week after the Yahoo hack when Michael, sitting in his dimly lit room, began plotting his next move. There was something about the chaos, the power, the ability to bring giants to their knees that kept him coming back for more. He had ignited a fire within the world of cybersecurity, and while the news was still echoing the shock of Yahoo's downfall, Michael was already planning the next storm. He was ready to turn his uprising into an all-out assault. This was no longer just about proving his skills. It had become about dominating the digital world. Michael, barely 15, saw himself not as a villain but as someone holding up a mirror to society, forcing them to look at their vulnerabilities. But it wasn't just Yahoo in his crosshairs anymore. His target list was expanding. He was about to show the world that the security measures they trusted were nothing but a fragile facade. A facade that he, a teenager from Montreal, could shatter with ease. There was eBay, a bustling marketplace that had redefined online shopping. CNN, the news network that everyone trusted to keep them informed. Amazon, the pioneer of e-commerce. And Dell, one of the leading tech companies of the time. Each of these companies was a symbol of the internet's promise, of a future that seemed bright and unbreakable. And yet, Michael was about to prove just how wrong that perception was. The tension was palpable as Michael sat at his desk, staring at the list of targets on his screen. He knew that with each attack, he was escalating not only his notoriety, but also the risk. The thrill of being untouchable, of being Mafia boy, was starting to come with a creeping sense of danger. The authorities were on high alert, and every hack increased the chance of them catching on to him. But Michael wasn't ready to stop. In fact, the stakes only made it more exhilarating. He felt like a modern-day David, taking on the Goliaths of the digital age, armed with nothing more than his computer and a deep understanding of the internet's weak spots. On February 11, 2000, Michael initiated the next phase of his uprising. The first to fall was eBay. With the same precision and calculation that had brought down Yahoo, Michael unleashed a torrent of data, overwhelming the servers and rendering the website inaccessible. The bustling marketplace came to a grinding halt. Sellers, buyers, and even eBay's own engineers scrambled to understand what was happening. Michael watched as the news reports came in, one after another, describing the outage. He was in control. He had the power to disrupt the digital heartbeat of the world, and nothing could compare to that feeling. But Michael wasn't done. The very next day, he turned his attention to CNN. He wanted to silence the very platform that had covered his previous attack. He flooded CNN's servers with traffic, taking the news giant offline. The irony wasn't lost on him. The media that had covered his audacious Yahoo hack was now scrambling to cover their own outage. It was a statement, a way of showing that no one was safe, not even those who wielded the power of information. Amazon and Dell were next in line. Michael's plan was meticulous, targeting them one after the other, ensuring that each attack was as precise and effective as the last. By February 15, 2000, Amazon, the e-commerce giant, fell victim to Michael's attack. Customers were locked out, transactions were halted, and chaos ensued. The following day, Dell's website was hit, leaving the company unable to process orders or provide customer support. The scale of the disruption was massive, and for those watching, it was almost incomprehensible that all of this could be orchestrated by one teenager, operating from the shadows. The media, the public, and even the corporations themselves were in a state of disbelief. The narrative shifted from a single incident involving Yahoo to a full-blown crisis. Questions began to surface. Who was behind this? Was this the work of a group, perhaps an organization with an agenda? The idea that one individual could orchestrate such a widespread attack seemed impossible to most people. But Michael, with his computer, his skills, and his audacity, was proving the impossible to be true. Behind the scenes, Law enforcement agencies were in a frenzy. The FBI, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and cybersecurity experts were working tirelessly, trying to trace the attacks, to find a clue that would lead them to the perpetrator. But Michael had been careful. He knew the risks, and he had taken measures to cover his tracks. He was elusive, a ghost in the machine, and the authorities were left chasing shadows. He watched the news reports, the interviews with experts who speculated about who could be behind the attacks, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had become a specter, haunting the digital world. Michael's friends had no idea about the double life he was leading. To them, he was just another teenager, maybe a bit more into computers than most, but certainly not someone capable of bringing down some of the biggest companies in the world. But Michael wasn't just anyone. He was Mafia boy, and he was writing his own story one attack at a time. He was pushing the world to the edge, showing them the cracks in the systems they had come to trust so blindly. As Michael planned his next move, he knew that the authorities were getting closer. The risk was growing with each attack, and the margin for error was shrinking. But the thrill, the rush of seeing his targets fall, was too much to resist. He was addicted to the power, to the chaos, and to the knowledge that he was the one calling the shots. He was redefining what it meant to be a hacker, and the world was watching, whether they knew it or not. And so, as Michael set his sights on his next target, a sense of inevitability began to creep in. He knew the authorities would catch up eventually. He knew that this game couldn't go on forever. But until that day came, he was going to keep pushing, keep hacking, and keep proving that no one was safe. The uprising was far from over, and the world was about to see just how far one teenager was willing to go to make his mark. Stay with me, because the next chapter in Michael's journey takes a darker turn. The authorities were closing in, and the thrilling game of cat and mouse was about to get very real. The question now was, how much longer could Michael stay one step ahead? And how would he face the consequences of the digital revolution he had started? Did you guys see Dell's site go down? Yeah, that was me. Michael Calci, known as Mafia Boy, typed those words into an online chat room, his fingers moving confidently across the keyboard. He couldn't help but brag. He was proud of what he'd done, proud of the chaos he'd unleashed. But that single boast, just a few words thrown into the ether, would set off a chain of events that turned Michael from an invisible specter into a hunted figure. His confidence was about to cost him everything. It was shortly after the Dell attack when Michael's bravado spilled over in the chat room. Up until that point, he had remained relatively anonymous, careful not to leave too many breadcrumbs for the authorities to follow. But success had a way of loosening lips, and Michael's adrenaline-fueled need for validation had gotten the better of him. He wanted recognition, even if it came from strangers hiding behind screen names. The problem was he wasn't the only one watching. The authorities, already on high alert after the attacks on Yahoo, eBay, CNN, and Amazon, were monitoring every corner of the web for clues. And Michael, in his teenage arrogance, had just handed them the key. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, had already begun coordinating efforts to track down the mysterious hacker behind the attacks. The digital world had been thrown into disarray by Mafia Boy's spree, and the powers that be were determined to find him. They knew they were dealing with someone who was clever, someone who understood the weaknesses of the internet better than most. But they also knew that every hacker, no matter how careful, made mistakes, and Michael had just made his. The chat room boast was a crucial turning point. It wasn't just that Michael had claimed responsibility for the Dell attack, an attack that hadn't even been publicized yet. It was that he had done so in such a cavalier manner, as if he were untouchable. To the FBI and RCMP agents combing through logs and piecing together fragments of information, this was the break they had been waiting for. The net was tightening, and Michael had no idea just how close they were. For Michael, life continued much as it had before. He spent his days in his room, his eyes fixed on his computer screen, oblivious to the world outside. He felt invincible, like he was playing a game that he could never lose. He watched as the news covered the attacks, as experts speculated on who might be behind them, and he couldn't help but smile. They had no idea it was just a teenager from Montreal, sitting in his bedroom, who had brought some of the world's biggest corporations to their knees. But behind the scenes, the game was changing. The authorities were watching, and they were getting closer with every passing day. The investigation picked up speed. The FBI and RCMP began tracing IP addresses, piecing together a trail that led them closer to Montreal. They knew they were dealing with someone young, someone who had an intimate understanding of network vulnerabilities but lacked the experience to cover all his tracks. The digital footprint that Michael had tried so hard to obscure was starting to come into focus. Investigators began narrowing their search, and the name Mafia Boy was no longer just a faceless alias. They were getting closer to discovering the person behind the screen. Michael, in his oblivion, continued to operate as though nothing had changed. He still logged into chat rooms, still interacted with others in the online hacking community, and still reveled in the chaos he had caused. But the walls were closing in. The authorities were methodical, patient, and relentless. They knew that with each boast, each tiny slip-up, they were getting closer to identifying the hacker who had humiliated some of the biggest names in the digital world. Michael's sense of security was nothing more than an illusion, one that was about to shatter. In March 2000, the RCMP finally had enough information to make their move. They had traced the attacks back to a specific neighborhood in Montreal, and they knew it was only a matter of time before they pinpointed the exact location. The investigation had been long and tedious, but they were closing in. The FBI was pushing for answers, and the RCMP was determined to deliver. Michael's bravado had led them straight to him, and now they were ready to strike. For Michael, the realization that he was being hunted came slowly. It began with a creeping sense of unease, a feeling that something was off. He noticed strange activity online, accounts that seemed to be watching him, questions being asked in chat rooms that seemed too specific. He tried to shake it off, convincing himself that he was just being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It gnawed at him, a constant reminder that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. The anxiety grew as Michael started to see more signs. He began to notice inconsistencies in his connections, strange lags that felt different, as if someone was intercepting his data. He had always prided himself on being one step ahead, but now it felt like he was being watched from the shadows. Michael's online friends began to distance themselves, sensing the heat that was closing in. They knew what Michael was doing was risky, and none of them wanted to be caught in the crossfire. The once exhilarating world of online hacking began to feel like a trap, and the thrill of the game started to wane. The morning of his arrest was like any other. Michael woke up, logged onto his computer, and began his usual routine. He had no idea that outside his house, RCMP officers were preparing to move in. They had been watching the house for days, waiting for the right moment, and now it was time. The knock on the door was loud and insistent, and Michael's heart skipped a beat. He knew, even before his mother opened the door, that it was over. The illusion of invincibility shattered in an instant, replaced by a cold, hard reality. The officers moved quickly, their voices stern as they entered the house. Michael was led away, his hands cuffed behind his back, his head spinning. The world outside was suddenly very real and very unforgiving. The game he had been playing had caught up to him, and now he was facing the consequences. As he was placed in the back of a police car, Michael looked back at his house, at the life he had known, and realized that everything had changed. He wasn't Mafia Boy anymore. He was just Michael Kelsey, a 15-year-old who had pushed too far and now had to pay the price. The news of Michael's arrest spread quickly. The media, the same media that had covered his attacks with a mix of fear and awe, now covered his downfall. The Mafia Boy who had taken on the giants of the digital age was just a teenager, a kid who had gotten in over his head. The world watched as Michael was led into court, as the charges were read out, and as the reality of his actions finally set in. The chase was over, but the story was far from finished. Michael was about to face the consequences of his actions, and the world was waiting to see what would happen next. The sense of invincibility that had once fueled Michael's every move was gone, replaced by the cold reality of the justice system. He sat in the courtroom, surrounded by adults who looked at him not as a kid, but as a criminal. The gravity of what he had done weighed heavily on him. He had wanted to make a name for himself, to prove something, but now all he felt was regret. His parents sat in the back of the courtroom, their faces a mix of worry and disbelief. They had never imagined that their son could be capable of something like this. Stay with me, because the next chapter in Michael's journey is about to unfold. The arrest was just the beginning. The question now was, what would the courts decide? And how would a 15-year-old boy who had shaken the digital world to its core face the consequences of his actions? The resolution was coming, and it would be one that Michael and the world would never forget. September 2001. The court was packed with reporters, government officials, and curious onlookers, all eager to see what fate awaited the teenager who had single-handedly shaken the digital world to its very core. Michael Calci, the 15-year-old better known as Mafia boy, sat in the defendant's seat, his face a mask of stoicism. The journey from hacker hero to accused criminal had been a long one, and now, finally, the reckoning had come. Michael knew that he wasn't just on trial for what he had done. He was on trial for what he represented. The fear that the digital world, the world that everyone was growing to depend on, was vulnerable, and that a teenager could break it. He could feel the weight of that expectation pressing down on him, the gazes of those in the courtroom heavy with judgment. But he also knew deep down that he was still just a kid who had gotten in over his head, one who had acted without truly understanding the consequences. The judge, a stern-faced man in his 50s, looked down at Michael, his eyes searching for the person behind the hacker alias. He read out the list of charges, over 50 in total. Each one was a reminder of the chaos Michael had caused, the businesses he had disrupted, and the fear he had spread. The courtroom was silent as the judge spoke, every word echoing off the walls. Michael's parents sat in the gallery, their faces etched with worry. They had watched helplessly as their son transformed from a curious teenager to an international headline, and now all they could do was wait. When it came time for Michael to speak, he stood up, his hands trembling slightly. He looked around the room, at the people who had come to see him fall. He apologized, not just to the companies he had attacked, but to his parents, to the people who had believed in him. He spoke about his intentions, how he had never meant to cause real harm, how he had gotten caught up in the thrill of it all. His voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of his actions finally hitting him. He wasn't Mafia boy anymore. He was just Michael, a kid who had made a series of terrible choices. The judge listened, his expression unreadable. And then, finally, the sentence was handed down. 8 months of open custody, which meant that Michael would spend time in a group home rather than a traditional juvenile detention center. 1 year of probation, restricted use of the internet, a small fine. The punishment was lenient, given the scale of Michael's crimes, but the judge made it clear that this was a wake-up call. Michael had been given a second chance, one that many believed he didn't deserve. But the hope was that he would learn, that he would change. Michael's reaction was a mix of relief and fear. He had avoided the worst. He wasn't going to prison, and he wasn't going to be cut off from the world completely. But the reality of what lay ahead was daunting. Open custody meant living away from his family, in a place where his every move would be monitored. Probation meant that he would have to prove himself every day to show that he could be trusted again. And the internet, the place that had once been his playground, was now off limits, a constant reminder of the mistakes he had made. The media reaction to Michael's sentencing was mixed. Some saw it as a slap on the wrist, a sign that the justice system wasn't taking cybercrime seriously enough. Others saw it as a fair punishment for a teenager who had made mistakes, but hadn't truly understood the consequences. The headlines were harsh, painting Michael as everything from a misunderstood genius to a dangerous criminal. But behind the headlines, Michael was just a kid trying to figure out what came next. The aftermath of the trial was a difficult time for Michael. He moved into the group home where he was surrounded by other young offenders, each with their own stories, their own regrets. It was a stark contrast to the freedom he had once known, the freedom to explore the digital world without boundaries. But it was also a chance for Michael to reflect, to understand why he had done what he had done, and to figure out who he wanted to be. The group home was strict, but it also offered support. Counselors who listened, programs that helped Michael channel his curiosity in more productive ways. As the months passed, Michael began to change. He started to see the internet not as a place to exploit, but as a tool, something that could be used for good. He enrolled in classes, learned about cybersecurity, and began to understand the importance of protecting the systems he had once attacked. The thrill of hacking had been replaced by something else, a desire to make amends, to use his skills to help rather than harm. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were days when Michael struggled, when the temptation to slip back into old habits was strong. But he kept going, determined to prove that he was more than just Mafia boy. The year of probation was a test, one that Michael was determined to pass. He checked in with his probation officer, followed the rules, and slowly began to rebuild his life. The restrictions on his internet use were lifted gradually, and Michael found himself back online. But this time, it was different. He was careful, respectful of the boundaries that had once seemed so easy to cross. He knew that the world was watching, that any slip-up would be met with harsh consequences, but more importantly, he knew that he didn't want to go back to the way things had been. Michael's story didn't end with the trial or the probation. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that was about redemption and growth. He had faced the consequences of his actions, had seen the impact of what he had done, and now he was determined to make things right. The world had seen him as a villain, as a threat, but Michael wanted to be something more. He wanted to be someone his parents could be proud of, someone who used his talents for good. In the years that followed, Michael became an advocate for cybersecurity, using his story as a cautionary tale. He spoke at schools, at conferences, sharing his experiences, hoping to reach other young people who might be tempted to follow in his footsteps. He talked about the thrill, the excitement, but also about the consequences, the reality of what it meant to cross the line. He wanted to show that there was another way, that the skills that made someone a hacker could also make them a protector. Michael Kelsey, the teenager who had once brought the internet to its knees, had grown up. He was no longer Mafia boy. He was Michael, a young man who had made mistakes, but who had also learned from them. His story was one of recklessness and consequence, but it was also one of redemption. And as he stood in front of audiences, sharing his journey, Michael knew that he had been given a second chance, one that he wasn't going to waste. The impact of Michael's actions rippled far beyond his own life. The attacks he carried out, though disruptive, served as a wake-up call for the entire world. Governments and corporations alike began to take cybersecurity more seriously. The vulnerabilities that Michael had exploited were patched, and new measures were put in place to prevent similar incidents. The era of lax internet security was coming to an end, and Michael's actions had played a significant role in that shift. For Michael, watching the changes unfold was bittersweet. On one hand, he knew that the chaos he had caused had led to positive developments in the long run. But on the other, he couldn't help but feel a pang of regret for the damage he had done. He had seen firsthand the fear and uncertainty that his actions had caused, the financial losses that companies had suffered, and the trust that had been shattered. It was a heavy burden to bear, but it was also a reminder of why he needed to stay on the right path. Michael's relationship with his parents, once strained by his actions, slowly began to heal. They saw the effort he was making to turn his life around, the genuine desire to make amends. It wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild, but they were proud of the progress he was making. They attended his talks, watched as he spoke to young people about the dangers of hacking, and saw the impact he was having. For Michael, their support meant everything. It was a reminder that, no matter how far he had fallen, he could still rise again. The journey from hacker to advocate was not a straight path. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when Michael questioned whether he could truly change. But each time, he found the strength to keep going. He surrounded himself with people who believed in him, who supported his efforts to make a difference. And slowly, but surely, he began to carve out a new identity, one that was not defined by his past mistakes, but by his determination to learn from them. Michael's story became a symbol of the potential for change. He had once been the face of cybercrime, a reminder of how vulnerable the digital world could be. But now, he was a symbol of hope, proof that even those who had made the worst choices could find a way to make things right. His journey was far from over, but he was on the right path, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt a sense of peace. He had faced the consequences, had learned from his actions, and now he was ready to move forward, one step at a time, one day at a time.